Ah, dear listeners, imagine for a moment the country roads of Europe, the cramped cities, the fields of crops, and the seemingly peaceful towns where church bells echo. Everything is calm on the surface, but dark clouds are gathering in the sky. For this is one of the most difficult periods in human history, a time of the Black Death, a time of despair and fear. People are bewildered and helpless in the face of this deadly disease, the cause of which they do not know. Neither the wisdom of medicine nor the prayers of the Church can stop this catastrophe. The Black Death. Imagine a name that has been whispered with fear for centuries. It acts like an invisible enemy, knocking on everyone's door, from the palaces of kings to the humblest huts of villages. This is the story not just of a disease, but of how it changed people's beliefs, social structures, and even their understanding of art. So how did this great catastrophe come about? How did this invisible enemy that ravaged Europe shake the foundations of civilization? And how did people's resistance to this destruction shape the course of history? Today we will search for the answers to these questions and take a journey into the darkest days of humanity by tracing the trail of the Black Death. Starters build Black Death originated in the western parts of Europe. Now, hold on tight, because history always manages to surprise us. And this time, the story will leave a deep mark that will never be forgotten. If you're ready, let's start this bleak yet instructive journey together. So, how did Europe meet this dark catastrophe? Ah, my listeners, even before the Black Plague reached the soil of Europe, a wheel had been turning on this continent for centuries. It was the wheel of feudalism, a system that determined the whole order of life. In this long period of the Middle Ages, a social structure based on land ownership and loyalty prevailed. Everyone, from the king to the peasants, found a place in this system. However, the life and fate of each was shaped in the hands of the other. Wealth, population density, and productive power were measured in terms of land, which was under the control of lords and the church. Imagine that the lords of vast territories sat at the top of this order, amassing their wealth and their castles around them. The peasants, under the patronage of these lords, worked the land, planted crops, and were forced to produce more than their own labor in order to survive. Each peasant's produce fed their own families, with some of it, while the rest went to their lord's storehouses. And of course, the church, it too took its share and became an integral part of this system, promising to save the souls of the people. Another element of this system was the growing cities. Outside the rigid rules of the feudal structure, cities were centers of trade and artisans. Ports, marketplaces, and caravan routes were the trade arteries of Europe. Silk, spices, jewelry. Merchants transported these precious goods from the Far East and Mediterranean ports and spread them across the continent, bringing with them traces of new cultures. But this intense trade and mobility became a network that facilitated not only prosperity, but also the spread of disease. And the population, the population. By the early 14th century, Europe's towns and villages were teeming with people. Production had increased, the climate had mildewed, and this allowed the population to grow rapidly. However, there was a limit to everything. The large population led to a shortage in food production, land became inadequate, and eventually people had to live in more difficult conditions. But hunger and poverty were growing in the shadow of this population explosion. It took a spark to upset this tense balance. And that spark was approaching Europe, with a deadly wind blowing from the east. The fragile structure of the feudal order, the density of population, and the vast network of trade, all this was the perfect backdrop for a catastrophe to strike. But how did this catastrophe begin? When the Black Death arrived on the doorstep of Europe, what kind of danger did the people of the continent find themselves in? Let's take the first steps of this dark story together in the next episode. My dear listeners, today I will take you on a journey through the dusty roads of the past, following the footsteps of death to distant lands. The story of the Black Death is an epic that changed the fate not only of Europe, but of humanity. But this dark cloud did not suddenly descend on Europe. No, our story begins much earlier, in the vast steppes of Asia, on the ancient roads traveled by merchant caravans. By the late 13th century, somewhere in the interior of Asia, the seeds of the plague were being sown. This deadly germ, called Yersinia pestis, nested in the bodies of rodents and was carried by fleas to other living creatures. This small, invisible enemy was so ruthless that it could end a person's life in just a few days. The plague first appeared within the borders of the Mongol Empire. Imagine as the descendants of Genghis Khan ruled over this vast land, a disease was spreading rapidly. The Silk Road, controlled by the Mongols, not only carried valuable goods such as silk, spices, and jewelry, but also served as a transit route for deadly diseases. From the depths of China to the markets of Central Asia and beyond the Caspian Sea, this trade route set the stage for one of the greatest tragedies in human history, and the mobility of the Mongol armies caused the plague to spread even faster along these routes. By 1346, the plague had reached Kefe, a trading port on the Black Sea coast. Kefe was a port controlled by Genoese merchants and was like a gateway to the heart of Europe. It is in this port that another terrible story of the plague is told. When the Mongol armies besieged Kefe, many of their soldiers were broken by the plague. But instead of giving up as a tactic of war, they began catapulting the corpses of soldiers dying of the disease into the city. This terrible attack plunged not only the people of Kefe, but also Europe, into a darkness that would not be forgotten for centuries. Merchants fled Kefe by ship, bringing the plague with them to the ports of Europe. By 1347, the first outbreaks of the plague were reported in the Sicilian port of Messina. That port, once the pearl of trade in the Mediterranean, was now the starting point of the Black Death. Many of the crew of the ships docked in the harbor were dead or dying, and the disease spread not only from one person to another, but to everything, from the rats of the harbor to the beasts of burden of the merchants. From Messina, this black seed spread rapidly to other cities in Europe. Traveling along trade routes, markets, and caravan routes, the disease quickly captured the crowded towns and villages of Europe. People began to lose their loved ones in despair, not realizing what this disaster was. But the plague brought not only death, but also fear, panic, and chaos. So how did people react as this terrible disease spread across Europe? Some spoke of God's wrath, others looked for other culprits. How were the measures taken, and how did society react to this catastrophe? In the next episode, we will dive into the heart of the Black Death to find the answers to these questions. Are you ready? My friends, I will now take you to a moment that echoed with the waves of a harbor, but was struck by the blackest waves of fate. The calendars showed the year 1347. Europe was still unaware of the coming darkness. The glamorous Sicilian port of Messina was as lively and bustling as ever. It was like a bridge connecting the trade routes of the Mediterranean. Merchants arrived with spices, fabrics, and exotic goods. Ships loaded and set off on new voyages. One day that year, however, it was not only trade goods that arrived on the ships that docked in the harbor. Death traveled in the dark holds of the wooden ships. When the Genoese ships sailed from the Black Sea and arrived in Messina, everyone in the harbor noticed something strange about them. The decks were silent. Most of the crew were absent or gravely ill. The putrid stench of corpses filled the lungs of everyone who docked alongside the ships. But curiosity and the appetite for trade forced the people of the port to ignore the danger. Who knew that these ships were carrying not just cargo, but the fate of a continent? The deadly traveling companions on these ships were much smaller than humans, but much more dangerous. Fleas. The microbe Yersinia pestis was like a deadly poison carried by these fleas and reached the shore through their carriers, the rats. The rats spread rapidly from ship holds to warehouses in the harbor to houses on the streets. People were unaware of the deadly threat the rats carried, but these black rodents were the harbingers of death. In Messina, the epidemic soon broke out. At first, no one could understand what it was. Some believed it was some kind of bad weather from the sea. Others thought it was a punishment from God. But the truth was that this disease was neither merciful enough to answer a person's prayer, nor weak enough for any remedy to fight it. One day people were perfectly healthy, the next day they were dead. In one way, people were perfectly healthy. The next day they were dead. With death so swift and inevitable, fear spread quickly through the narrow streets of Messina. The epidemic crossed the borders of the port town and quickly moved to other cities along trade routes. From Sicily it spread to Genoa, Marseille, and many other Mediterranean ports. As people lost their lives and loved ones in desperation, no one knew how to stop it. Churches were overflowing, people were kneeling to ask for forgiveness, but death would not hear their prayers. The first footsteps of the Black Death began to tear apart not only the people, but also the fabric of society. Trade stopped, the streets emptied, and the fear of disease paralyzed people's daily lives. But how did this terrible epidemic reach the depths of Europe? And how did people try to survive in this uncertainty? We will discover the answers to these questions together in the next episode. Get ready, because this story is about to get darker and darker. Ah, my friends, the Black Death's grip was not so limited as to stop only in a city, a harbor, or a village. Death moved like an invisible soldier, creeping in silently, everywhere, without anyone even noticing. But to understand its true bearers, we must look a little deeper. The Black Death's soldiers were not men armed with swords, but tiny creatures barely visible even with a magnifying glass. Here is the terrifying story of this invisible army. Let's start with rats. In Europe of that time, rats were a natural part of life. They roamed the cobbled streets of cities, the stalls of marketplaces, the corners of houses, even the kitchens of palaces. People were unaware of their danger. Rats would steal crumbs of food and quietly retreat to their corners. But hiding on the backs of these seemingly innocent creatures was another creature that carried Europe's worst nightmare: fleas. Fleas clung to the skin of mice, sucking their blood, and some of these tiny creatures had a deadly mission, thanks to a germ they carried. Yersinia pestis. While rats traveled among the cargo on ships docked in ports, fleas crawled on the animals carried on these ships. When ships arrived in new ports, these deadly carriers immediately found new homes. spreading from city to city. People did not notice the rats spreading from ports to markets and from markets to homes. But once the disease had crept in, it was almost impossible to stop it. And fleas, my friends, don't just stick to rats. Once they came into contact with humans, they attached themselves directly to human skin, sucking their blood and transferring the deadly germ into the human body. Within a short period of time, the person bitten by fleas would begin to shiver with a high fever and develop painful bumps on their body. But this was not the only way the disease spread. Before the poor victims died, the disease could even spread through a person's breath. The plague would enter the air with the cough of an infected person and fill the lungs of others. The crowded streets of cities, hospitals, and churches were the easiest hunting grounds for this invisible enemy. Imagine that. If one person coughed in a marketplace, in just a few days you could see that everyone in that marketplace was sick. On top of that, there was an added fact. The cleanliness habits of the people of that time accelerated the spread of disease. Garbage accumulated in the narrow streets of the cities, and ditches filled with sewage smelled of death. Rats and fleas used this dirty environment as a playground. While the poor lived close to each other in crowded houses, the disease was destroying not just a family, but an entire neighborhood. But my dear friends, there is another dimension to this. The Black Death was not only the work of these tiny creatures and germs. People's own fear and desperation fueled the spread of the disease. Those who wanted to escape death fled from city to city, village to village. But without realizing it, they were carrying the disease with them. This terrible epidemic was spreading to wider and wider areas, with one man's desperate steps. So, my friends, what could people do in the face of this invisible army? Prayer, cure, or simply resign themselves to their fate? In the next chapter, we will explore together how people tried to fight against this dark nightmare and how their fears shaped them. I ask you now, in a world where death is so powerful, is it possible to survive? My friends, those years when the Black Death spread across Europe were the scene of one of the greatest tragedies in human history. Every city, every village, every town I saw became a silent graveyard. The farmers who had worked in the lush green fields, the shopkeepers who cheerfully strolled the cobbled streets, the priests who rang the bells of the churches, one by one, they all fell prey to this terrible disease. And what remained were empty houses, abandoned lands, and heartbreaking silence. Imagine that Europe had a population of around 80 million people at the time. The Black Death wiped out half, and in some places 2/3 of this huge population. In the countryside, villages were completely emptied. Fields were left uncultivated and animals unmilked. Amidst the lush green meadows there were wandering herds and helpless peasants with their necks bowed. People were dying so fast. So many graves were buried en masse in pits. Some villages were wiped off the map, their inhabitants gone, the fields overgrown with weeds. But my friends, the situation in the cities was even more frightening. The narrow streets were filled with crowds of disease-ridden people. Lamentations rose from every house. A funeral was held on every corner. Great cities like Florence, London, and Paris had turned into killing fields. There were abandoned cars on the streets, orphan children and people in tears, not knowing what to do. At that time, the epidemic spread so rapidly that even the rich could not find a place to flee. Armed guards at the city gates locked the doors, hoping to keep the disease out. But even these measures were futile. The plague blew through like the wind. The devastation in the countryside also hit the cities. Crops were not harvested and animals were not milked, so cities faced famine. Hunger followed in the footsteps of the disease and continued to consume people. Artisans and merchants either died or had to give up their businesses. Daily life came to a standstill. Marketplaces emptied, workshops closed, streets fell silent. Even the churches could not escape the devastation. Many of the priests fell ill and died while giving last rites to their sick parishioners. And my friends, do you know what was the saddest thing of all? People's trust in each other was shaken. Neighbors ran away from each other, even families abandoned each other. People even left their loved ones alone for fear of, you carry the disease. This meant not only physical destruction, but also social collapse. But however deep the death and destruction, at the end of this dark period, the seeds of a new world would begin to sprout. So, my friends, how did this loss of population lead to the shaking of the feudal order and the birth of a new economic structure? That we will journey together in the next chapter to find out. Second mistake has inherited from the first. A man consults his reason and declares that murder is illegal. Ah, my dear friends, in the aftermath of the Black Death, not only were there empty fields and silent streets across Europe, but the very fabric of society was deeply scarred. The pandemic uprooted not only bodies, but also the cornerstones of the human order. And the greatest of these stones was the feudal system that had been embedded in Europe for centuries. For many years, the feudal system had created a system in which peasants were dependent on lords. The peasants who cultivated their fields depended on the land for their livelihood and to serve their lords. However, the Black Death took away the hands that plowed those fields. More than half of the villages were depopulated, leaving the once teeming farmlands silent. The surviving villagers no longer harbored the fears of the past, but with a new courage born of survival, made different demands. Lords unable to find laborers had to knock on the doors of the surviving peasants to cultivate their fields. But, my dear friends, things were not the same as before. The peasants were no longer willing to work for low wages or in enforced dependence. Labor had become so scarce that a peasant's labor had become as precious as gold. It was then that the peasants used this power to demand better conditions, higher wages, more freedom. And they were brave enough to rise up if necessary to get it. And revenge, consequences beyond our own will, is the wisdom of the soul. During this period, rebellions broke out all over Europe. The famous Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381 was one of the most striking examples of how the Black Death had a profound impact on society. The peasants, who had once submitted to the orders of their lords, were now defending their own rights and shouting their demands in the village squares. Enough is enough, they were saying. We are neither lords of the land nor slaves. We are human beings too. We want to live with dignity. These revolts began to shatter the foundations of the feudal system. The lords now realized that they would have to build an order of free workers, not peasants tied to the land. As the feudal system collapsed, a new economic order began to emerge in Europe. The monetary economy gained importance, trade revived, and cities began to teem with merchants and artisans. But my friends, this great transformation was not without pain. Landowners passed laws to regain their lost power. They pressured peasants to return to the old order. But these efforts were not always reciprocated. The Black Death left not only death and suffering, but also lit a fire of rebellion that would reshape the social fabric of Europe. So, my friends, how did these winds of change bring Europe into the modern age? What kind of future did people begin to shape after this painful transformation? We will look for answers to these questions in the next chapter. Imagine, my dear friends, what would happen if a building on which people had pinned their hopes, their fears, even their futures, suddenly crumbled to the ground. As the dark shadow of the Black Death fell over Europe, not only bodies but souls as well were deeply wounded. And the greatest of these wounds was to the reputation of the Church, where the people had taken refuge for centuries. In medieval Europe, the Church was not just a place of worship, it was at the center of life. From birth to death, people depended on the Church's guidance in every moment. Prayers, ceremonies, blessings, everything was done under the protective hand of God. When the epidemic broke out, the leaders of the Church organized prayers and rituals to calm the people and prevent disease. In 1775, the bells rang incessantly. The priests performed ceremony after ceremony, saying that the disease was a test or wrath of God. But every prayer, every ritual, was powerless against the relentless grip of the plague. Priests and churchmen were dying along with the people, sometimes succumbing to fear and abandoning their duties. In its helplessness, the Church faced accusations of not only failing to stop the plague, but also of not doing enough to support its people. People began to ask, if God is with us, why are we suffering so much? These questions began in whispers and then were voiced out loud in the squares. Of course, the Church was not indifferent to these questions. To create scapegoats, it blamed witches, heretics, and even communities of different faiths. Jews were often targeted during this period. They were alleged to have poisoned wells and spread disease. But my friends, these accusations could neither stop death nor revive faith. The Church's helpless behavior only created more suspicion. Among people, old pagan beliefs and different spiritual paths were being talked about again. Some people turned away from the God offered by the Church and looked for other answers. Some resorted to extreme means to cleanse themselves of sin. Remember how at that time there were flagellant groups roaming the streets, whipping their own bodies, and hoping to win God's forgiveness. Such extremes on the one hand and anger against the Church on the other turned the spiritual map of Europe upside down. And he uses the term biblical bewitching quite literally to describe it. And dear friends, this crisis was not limited to faith. The social and political power of the Church also suffered a great blow during this period. While the people were questioning the authority of the Church, they were also creating an environment that allowed new ideas to flourish. This questioning would pave the way for great revolutions and reforms in Europe in the future. But before those great reforms came, how did the spiritual world of the European people transform? What kind of spiritual journey did people embark on after these inquiries? Here in the next episode, we will trace these questions. My friends, close your eyes and immerse yourself in an age of bone-deep fear. The year is 1348. There is a silent hum, an almost palpable fear in the streets of Europe. The cold breath of death can be felt around every corner. As the Black Death spreads rapidly, people find the only way out is to flee and close their borders. But fleeing from what? against an invisible, odorless, intangible enemy? It is in the midst of this desperation that the first quarantine measures in the history of mankind appear on the scene. Venice, that glorious city of commerce, was a vibrant place, bustling with canals and harbors. But when the plague came, this vibrancy gave way to a struggle for survival. City leaders quickly realized how dangerous the disease was. To them, a single patient was a greater danger than a ship's cargo of grain. And so, for the first time in history, a quarantine rule was introduced for ships docking in ports. The word originates from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. Yes, ships were kept off the harbor for exactly 40 days. During this time, neither the crew could go out, nor the inhabitants of the city could approach them. The room became quiet, unopening days. But my friends, these rules were not easily accepted. For a city dependent on trade, such a pause was an economic disaster. Many merchants opposed the rules, fearing that their goods would spoil. But fear was stronger than greed for money. In Venice, not only the ships, but also some neighborhoods of the city were completely shut down. If disease was found in a house, the doors were sealed and those inside were left to their fate. Their only link with the outside world was the masked people who delivered food to them. All of a sudden, they turned to one another. Only Venice? No, my dear friends. Other European cities also began to adopt this new method. In Marseille, the ports were closed. In Florence, anyone thought to be carrying disease was banished outside the city walls. But these measures did not always go as planned. Some people fled the quarantine zones and carried the disease to more remote villages. So quarantine became not only a precaution, but also a source of tension and fear among the population. Imagine you wake up one morning and your neighborhood is sealed off. Your neighbors are silent, the streets are empty. So was running away really the solution? Or would the disease follow you like a shadow, spreading further with every step? But, this story doesn't end there. People tried to fight not only the quarantines, but the disease itself. So who were the plague doctors of that time? And how did they fight? Well, we will discover that together in the next episode. My dear friends, imagine, as death stalks the streets, you look around helplessly and ask, who will save us from this scourge? And in a world where that question resonated, they appeared. Plague doctors, with their cloaks, masks, and strange methods. They were like actors in a dark theater. But this was no theater. This was the story of those walking a thin tightrope between life and death. The plague doctors were perhaps the bravest figures of that era. Most of them were not trained physicians, but that didn't really matter, because no one really understood this disease. The plague was a mystery, a riddle, and the doctors were trying to understand the pieces of this puzzle. They wore long black cloaks and hid their faces with long beaked masks. These masks were filled with fragrant herbs, such as lavender, thyme, or rosemary. Why? Because at that time, it was believed that disease was spread by bad odors, that is, by poisonous air called miasma. Doctors thought they could protect themselves with these masks. But oh my friends, masks alone were not enough. They carried a long stick to touch the sick. This stick kept them away from diseased bodies. Imagine a doctor approaches you, but he cannot touch you. He can only point at your body with his stick. What a strange scene, isn't it? But this stick was not only a means of protection, it was also used to treat the sick. For example, the most visible signs of the plague, swollen, pus-filled lymph nodes, colloquially called bubliak were popped by doctors with these sticks. People believed that this would force the bad blood out of the body. But most of the time, these interventions had much worse consequences than saving the patient. So, were only doctors involved in this struggle? No, my dear friends. Healers, priests, and even ordinary people were also part of this war. Especially in rural areas, people known colloquially as wise women or healing hands played a major role. They prepared herbal remedies, offered prayers to calm the sick, and sometimes invoked supernatural powers. Ointments made with lavender oil, mixtures made with burning herb, all these methods were used to give people a glimmer of hope. But unfortunately, hope was a weak shield against the plague. Nevertheless, their efforts shaped the medical understanding of the time. What seems strange to us today was then a brave way of facing the disease, despite a lack of knowledge. Everything from the herbs in the masks to the bloodletting was part of a search for a solution. And it is important to remember that these people were not only fighting the disease, but also the fear and anger of society. Plague doctors and healers were sometimes heroes, sometimes scapegoats. But my dear friends, despite all these efforts, the terrible claws of the plague could not be stopped. So, how did societies change during these dark days? What did people learn from this terrible experience? The answers to these questions will lead us to our next story. Are you ready? My dear friends, whenever there has been a great catastrophe in history, people have looked for someone to blame. Sometimes it has been an enemy, sometimes nature, but more often it has been a group that is weak, different, or easily targeted. As the shadow of the Black Plague fell over Europe, this ancient cycle played out once again. In those dark days of death, despair, and fear, as people desperately tried to understand the causes of the disease, they turned their eyes to Jews, gypsies, and other minorities. And so began a human story that grew darker and darker in the shadow of a dark catastrophe. As the plague spread rapidly, panic grew in villages, towns, and cities. People were dying, all efforts were in vain, and the source of the disease remained a mystery. It was at this point that a simple but dangerous thought spread. This must be a conspiracy. Some began to believe that the Jews were poisoning the well water. These rumors echoed across Europe. Jewish communities were declared the main culprits for the disaster. Unfortunately, history does not look for evidence or logic in such moments, but only surrenders to anger fueled by prejudice. Finally, public anger exploded, especially in areas with large Jewish populations. People were taken from their homes and taken to demonstrations in squares where it was as if they were on trial. They were declared guilty, often without being given a single word of defense. Many were tortured and even burned alive. In Basel, Switzerland, hundreds of Jews were locked in a barn and burned. In Cologne, Germany, Jewish neighborhoods were looted and their inhabitants massacred. These acts of violence became so widespread that some cities found a solution by expelling Jews altogether. But my dear friends, Jews were not targeted alone during this terrible period. Gypsies, lepers, and other different groups were also victims of this wave of violence. At times, even the strange or outcast members of a village were blamed for the plague. People were desperate for a scapegoat, and any difference was enough to be blamed. So what was the source of this anger? It was not only fear, of course. This period also brought with it an era of opportunism. Not only hatred was behind the violence, but also greed for property. The homes and properties of wealthy Jewish merchants were looted, and the property of those who were deported or murdered was confiscated. Some nobles and rulers used these events for their own benefit. They targeted such communities to distract public attention from economic hardships and criticism of the government. Beyond the physical devastation of the plague, these horrific events were indicative of the spiritual collapse of society. People became victims not only of the disease, but of their own anger and hatred. But my friends, it must be remembered that even in these dark days, humanity did not completely lose hope. Some leaders and communities stood up against these injustices and tried to protect the innocent. Pope Clemens VI even issued decrees trying to stop the attacks against the Jews, declaring that there was no scientific or religious basis for accusing them. Unfortunately, even his efforts were often not enough to stop the blind rage. But stop and think. When people succumb to their own fears and find someone to blame, what do they lose? Justice, compassion, humanity. These are questions that remain to be answered today, as they were then. But for now, let's move on to our next story. And when the plague began to end, what did people learn from this terrible experience? How was life reshaped? Let's discover this together. My dear friends, even in those horrible years, living in the shadow of the Black Plague, hope managed to sprout somewhere in the hearts of human beings. Yes, the smell of death was everywhere, and sadness reigned in every street. But fate is not always equal. While parts of Europe were ravaged by the disease, some regions were miraculously less affected or completely spared. These regions became symbols of resistance to the plague, raising the question that has been asked throughout history: why did some places suffer less than others from this terrible plague? The answer, my dear friends, is complex and multi-layered. First of all, geography and isolation factors must be mentioned. In particular, villages in mountainous regions or settlements far from trade routes had a natural line of defense against the pandemic. Villages high in the Pyrenees, for example, were able to protect themselves before the disease climbed and crossed the mountains. They were not visited as often as the cities, which were heavily traded, and flea rats, the carriers of the plague, were not as common. Likewise, the severity of winters in parts of northern Europe slowed the spread of both fleas and the disease. The cold weather limited the amount of time people spent outdoors and broke the chain of infection. But geography alone was not enough. Human behavior and the decisions of local governments also played a big role in these differences. For example, while some cities like Florence were drowning in panic and chaos at the onset of the disease, places like Venice and Ragusa took early measures. Venice was one of the first cities in history to systematically implement the concept of quarantine to prevent the spread of the disease. They decided that before ships docked in the harbor, the crew and cargo should be isolated for a certain period of time. In Italian, this period was called 40 giorni, or 40 days. The Venetians' rigor helped to reduce mortality rates in the city, and perhaps prevented the disease from spreading further. Yet, these success stories were not limited to physical measures. The spirit of community solidarity, the support of neighbors, and the people's increased attention to religious rituals, perhaps mixed with fear, also played a role. People prayed in mass in churches, mosques, and even in open spaces, seeking to appease the wrath of the gods or nature. Some historians argue that such communal rituals actually accelerated the spread of the disease, but coming together spiritually had a positive effect on people's morale. Perhaps this strengthened their immunity, or perhaps it simply helped them to maintain their zest for life. Of course, some regions were lucky. But luck is not always fair, is it? It is hard to say that those who survived the plague or those who lived in less affected areas deserved it. And yet one cannot help trying to understand these differences. Perhaps nature has a secret that always refuses to be fully understood. We, as well as the scientists of that period, are trying to unravel the secrets of these resistance settlements. So, my dear friends, what did these stories of resistance become after the end of the plague? How did these lucky or precautionary societies cope with the burden and responsibility of survival? How was life reshaped in the aftermath of this catastrophe? Let's look for answers to these questions together in the next episode, my dear friends. When the plague, that dark shadow, finally began to recede, it left behind ruined cities, depleted peoples, and a changed world. A world so changed that no one even wanted to remember the days of hope before the plague. But human nature being what it is, survivors always find a way to start again. This is the story of such resilience as the horrors of the Black Plague began to fade, and the rebuilding and recovery in different corners of Europe. As the waves of the plague receded, there was silence in villages and cities. But this silence was not peaceful, but filled with the echo of what had been lost. Once bustling marketplaces were now empty. The land waiting to be cultivated on the farms was neglected, the roads overgrown with weeds. It was in these moments that the first seeds of the greatest rebuilding process in human history were sown. At the same time as people mourned what they had lost, they banded together and tried to find a way to survive. Landowners and lords faced labor shortages. Fields were not planted and animals were not grazing. Farmers and peasants found it impossible to find enough people to replace those who had died. But this disaster also created an opportunity. Labor suddenly became much more valuable. Peasants, servants, and laborers could now demand better conditions. It was at this time that the foundation for fundamental changes in Europe's economic and social structure was laid. The feudal system slowly began to unravel. Serfs, once bound to their lord's lands, had the opportunity to gain their freedom. And, perceiving the opportunity for scale, the purchasing power of land began to shrink and the surrender mechanisms complete. The plague shook not only the economic order, but also religious structures. The church was both a beacon of hope and a source of frustration throughout this epidemic. Prayers and rituals to appease God's wrath strengthened the faith of many, but also disillusioned many others. If God does not protect us, then how are we to make sense of this world? They questioned, challenging the authority of the church. These questions ignited the first sparks of the Reformation movements that would sweep across Europe in the centuries to come. But change was not limited to the church or the feudal structure. The Black Plague radically changed the understanding of health and hygiene in cities. Cities like Venice and Milan introduced the first public health regulations during this period. Sewage systems, protection of water sources, and quarantine regulations ensured better preparedness against future outbreaks. People tried to build more organized and healthier cities by taking lessons from the suffering they had experienced. Art and literature were also influenced by this period, my friends. Having met the cold face of death so closely, humanity tried to understand the value of life and express it through art. While works such as Dante's Divine Comedy reflected the dark thoughts of this period, Boccaccio's Decameron told the story of a group of people escaping from the plague, revealing both the fears and the resilience of the human spirit. Of course, the recovery was not easy or quick. Europe struggled for generations to erase the scars of the Black Plague. But history remembers this period not only as a catastrophe, but also as the beginning of change and renewal. Humanity built bridges over the wounds inflicted by the plague, trying to build a stronger world to replace the one that had been destroyed. But dear friends, have you ever wondered how this period of reconstruction after the Black Plague shaped the future destiny of Europe? I will tell you the answer to that question in my next story. Hey, my dear friends, we have come to the end of another story. In this long and arduous journey, we have followed the dark shadow of the Black Plague step by step. I have tried to bring the fears, hopes, tragedies, and triumphs of the people out of the dusty pages of history and put them before your eyes. We have seen how the plague swept across Europe like a hurricane, how societies were destroyed and reborn. But most importantly, we witnessed how the human spirit persevered even in the face of such a catastrophe. Remember, this story was not just about death and destruction. As in every dark period, it was a harbinger of a new dawn. The dissolution of the feudal system, the first sparks of medicine and public health, the rise of art and literature, all sprouted from the cracks created by this terrible period. Like every crisis in human history, the Black Plague was both an end and a beginning. In this story, we saw how individuals and communities reacted, some succumbing to fear and rage, others choosing solidarity and creativity. From the empty streets of the cities to the abandoned fields in the villages, from minorities struggling with prejudices to physicians fighting for humanity, every detail shows us how the past is alive and full of lessons for today. Gutron said to this book, a little playing to my strengths. But my friends, this is not the end of my story. Because history is a story without end. Imagine how humanity emerged stronger from this ordeal, and what future paths the societies changed by the end of the plague will take. The plague left behind not only death, but also a story of resurrection. But how did the sparks of this resurrection spread into the following centuries? Can you see the clues of this journey leading to the bright ages of the Renaissance? Here, my dear friends, history offers us stories that are both cautionary and inspiring. Even in the darkness of the Black Plague, we can see the light of the human spirit. And now I leave you with the question: what lessons does this history teach us for future crises? Perhaps finding the answer to this question will be the starting point for our next conversation. And now allow this old sage to say goodbye until he joins you again in the next story. Remember, history is not only an echo of the past, it is also a guide for today and tomorrow. See you next time, dear friends.